Architectural delight. Oh, that's right. We're talking architecture. If talking about beauty is wrong, we don't want to be right. Eclectic, modernist, futuristic, guardian, cutting edge, rationalism, vernacular, visionary, pre-postmodern, romantic, invention, beauty, baby, beyond style, with your architect hosts, David Andriozzi, Elizabeth McNicholas, and Dan Morales. Architectural delight, baby. Yeah. Feel me? Oh, come on. Let's get it. Ow. Ooh. It's all here, folks. Look no further. Don't go anywhere. Right here, Architectural Delight.
Welcome. My name is David Andriozzi. Welcome to Architectural Delight. My name is David Andriozzi. My co-hosts are Elizabeth McNicholas and Dan Morales, three architects with very different perspectives, but in search for a new narrative. We're here with the support of the New England chapter of the Institute of Classical Architecture and Art, the ICAA, Traditional Building Magazine, and Residential Design Magazine. Thank you. At Architectural Delight, we believe that buildings should speak to the places they are built culturally and contextually. But mostly they should do this, they should delight, regardless of cost, style, or technique. People tend to save buildings that they love the most. Without architectural delight, no building is truly sustainable. Great architecture should be based on commodity, firmness, and delight, a framing that allows us to move beyond the style wars and focus on architecture and service the pleasure of the public. Today, we are really lucky. We're here to welcome Patrick Ahearn. Patrick is one of America's most celebrated classical architects and a fellow of the American Institute of Architects. He is focused on historically motivated, site-sensitive residents in New England and beyond for more than 40 years. On Martha's Vineyard alone, he has completed more than 350 residences, prompting Architectural Digest to proclaim, "This architecture is the reason why people covet Martha's Vineyard real estate." Patrick has been awarded degrees in architecture and urban design from Syracuse University and has taught coursework at both Syracuse and the Boston Architectural Center. Today, he oversees an architectural firm that bears his name in Boston and in Edgartown, while also deftly drafting firsthand. He's a recipient of many awards. Patrick and his work have been featured in numerous publications and broadcast outlets, including Architectural Digest, Wall Street Journal, HGTV, and more. His acclaimed monograph, Timeless, was published in 2018 and is on its 6th reprint.
Thank you, David.
Patrick has been a great supporter of the ICAA, both regionally and nationally. I say that because educating people on the importance of traditional and classical design is essential to the goal of prolonging urban fabrics that prioritize people and history. Finally, Patrick has been awarded at least 6 Bullfinch Awards, which is ICAA New England's highest, most coveted honor. That is quite an incredible accomplishment. Welcome, Patrick Ahearn.
Thank you. Thank you very much, David. Very appreciative.
So we'll jump right off. And again, this is just meant to be a sort of an informal discussion, and we'll see where it goes. I mentioned to people already is that there may be a Q&A at the end, and introduce yourself, please, in the other box. I'll start with your book. In the introduction to your new book, which is wonderful, titled "Timeless: Classical American Architecture for Contemporary Living," you mentioned that we make architecture for the greater good, not for the aggrandizement of our clients or ourselves, but to strengthen the urban and social fabric into which it is woven. I mean, to us at Architectural Digest, therein lies the most important role of an architect, to be a steward of the community's architectural fabric. Could you start by expounding on that responsibility? And part 2 of the question, when did that duty of guardianship hit you as a young emerging architect?
Well, I think some of the first things that I tell a client is it's not always about you. It's not always about what you want. But if you're coming into a community and you're going to develop a new project or a new home, I think it's really important that we talk about the greater good theory, is what I call it. So if you're developing a house and say you're on the waterfront and you could continue to have a view corridor to the harbor, why not do that? It's not just about having your house go all the way across the whole lot, other than the side yard setbacks. So I think there's an opportunity to educate clients early on in the process. For example, if a client has a large program and they envisioned it as one home or one large structure, maybe we could break it down into pieces, which is much more of a New England vernacular idiom, so that you could have this idea of implied history. You could have a carriage house or a barn or other outbuildings that will satisfy the programmatic needs of the client, but doing it in a way that is more in scale of the surroundings or the community or the history of how a community has grown and evolved over time. So one of the other mantras I use is it's all about scale. And again, if you want to be the most loved person in the community and you're doing something new that could be viewed as controversial, because in traditional New England architecture, change is bad, prove me wrong. So in Edgartown, when I started working there about 35 years ago, it was, vinyl siding and fluorescent lights and t-shirt shops and Memorial Day to Labor Day. And really the architecture of the past was not doing very well. So I saw an opportunity to really understand the context and scale of the community that was 350 years old. And people were talking about back then new urbanism and the idea of walkable village and a place that has natural amenities. Well, here we have the real thing. It's not watercolor or seaside. 350-year-old New England village that was based on the whaling industry in Edgartown, natural harbor, walkable village. The underlying zoning is, at the time, was 5,000 square foot lots, 5 foot side yard setbacks, and the average of the setbacks on the front of each lot. So there was this density that really is our friend. So many suburban communities talk about density as a negative entity, or the idea of a secondary structure, an accessory structure, as very negative in the traditional suburban community. So new urbanism really was a way for people to get a better understanding about how we could live in a more communal way that also reinforces the reason why you want to be in a community in the first place. So Edgartown really had the historical data and architecture that spoke to that. And I've been fortunate enough to do over 250 houses in 12 blocks in the last 35 years. And you can't tell my renovations from my new construction. But the houses live the way people want to live today. They're not museums. So I think my thinking in that process really evolved as I started to work in Edgartown and started to really see a way in which I could educate our client base to another way of thinking.
It's a high density. Hi, Patrick. It's Elizabeth. That's a very high density of, sort of a kingdom, an architectural kingdom that you have.
It's my HR training in real life.
Yeah. Do you, what sort of effort do you need to apply, or is it different on a case-by-case basis in terms of introducing, to the degree that variety is appropriate there, which, versus,
Well, so for example, within the village context, you have Federal Colonial, Greek Revival, some Victorian, not too much in Edgartown, but certainly on the island in Oak Bluffs. So there is a rich vocabulary of architectural styles that's already established. So for me, the question is, how can you be like the ghost in the night and no one knew you were there? So for example, my house in Edgartown Village, 1790 midshipman's house. In the early 1800s, they built a barn attached to the back of the house. And then they grew into the barn in the late 1800s. They built a livery stable because the lot goes spans 2 streets. So the livery stable 2 blocks from the harbor was on the backside. And at one time there was a tavern in the house, and it had these Rumford fireplaces and the tavern room and so on. And so I had the opportunity to lovingly restore it and bring the space between the back of the barn and the livery stable, and put a pool in it, a little courtyard, outdoor living room space. And I take people through the house and they said, we love the way you preserved the patina of the past, but lives the way it wants to live today. And then I tell them the truth, it's 100% brand new. And they say it's not possible. So that speaks to, my approach to architecture. Many architects, just by nature of being the creator, are known for a particular signature style. I'm not. I'm really silent on style. It's more about what is the context in which we work in tell us. And we do work all around the country in different communities and so on. So it's really about understanding what the community says. So for example, even on Martha's Vineyard, if we do a house in West Tisbury or Chilmark, which is a little more rural, we wouldn't do an Edgartown house. We're doing a house on Nantucket, other island right now, in the Nantucket Village core. And it's not quite as layered in terms of material and finishes. Edgartown's a little more polished in many ways. So we had to dumb it down a little bit to fit into the context of that community. So it's really about matching what the client's needs are and then educating them early on what might be appropriate. We're doing another house right now. It's a major renovation, restoration, and then a new guest house, a new carriage house, a cabana, pool, and the people are from Texas, from Austin, Texas. And they're young and they're successful and they have a mindset, in Texas, Houston, there's no zoning, they do what they want. And they had a very hard time understanding that the project they spent a lot of money on is in a historic district. So we needed to educate them to the rules of the road, but at the same time, show where you can have variety. If things are not visible from a public way, you have latitude. So there you can introduce more glazing, the solid to void relationships change. So you can do things like that and have the house open up to a garden or a yard and create these spines and the sense of organization within the programmatic needs of the client. But sheathe it in an architecture that is more quiet on the streetscape and more takes into consideration the overall ensemble of the street. And if you do that, I tell them you will be really loved, and you're coming from a new place and you want to embrace the community. You chose to buy there for a reason, and you shouldn't necessarily try to do the antithesis of what the community says.
Yeah, I think that's the greater good that you're talking about. I do a lot of work in new urbanist communities, and when they say, oh, why can't I do this? Why can't I do that? I say that the community is one of the amenities. It's not just your big family room or your big lot or your big this, but that you're all contributing, you're all sort of paying a tax for the greater good. And that's what makes these places so wonderful. And, that's why everyone travels to Edgartown and all these other places that everyone sacrifices a little so everyone can get a lot.
Right. And when you look back into the European cities, there's so many lessons about how density is our friend. And where I run into problems sometimes is with the boards in the different communities, because many of them, there are lay people on the boards, not always with architects or attorneys. And they have a hard time with that. In Edgartown, because of the underlying zoning was 5,000 square foot lots, they changed it really with a poor decision to 10,000 square foot lots, which then require you to go to the Zoning Board of Appeals on a lot of things, because the average lot size in the village is about 6,800 square feet. So the bureaucracy and the barriers of entry to do successful projects are really problematical if you don't have municipal boards that are enlightened to how density is our friend and how architecture can improve people's lives. So One of my biggest challenges is how to tell that narrative and tell the story in a way that the boards can embrace it, where they're not alienated by what you're proposing. And particularly in and around the Boston area, where you have these established suburban towns like in Wellesley and things like that, where I also own a home, but I also have been very involved. I was vice chairman of the planning board in Wellesley for a number of years. And the concept of having an accessory dwelling unit on a lot, like so that the parents could stay, or that the daughter who's now come home to teach in the school can't afford to live in a house. When I brought those topics up on the planning board many years ago, I was almost run out of town, like not in our community type attitude. Well, we don't want that. Even to this day, with so many great new urbanist projects being built all around the country, many of the established suburban towns are just not enlightened enough. And so I'd like to ask you, when you come into a community that you're going to develop a new urbanist project in, I mean, what is the response you get from the underlying zoning boards and things like that? Are they enlightened, or are they really saying, well, maybe that's fine in Washington, D.C., but in Utah, we really want open space and we want land, and we don't want our houses on top of each other. And that's really going to negatively affect the value of our real estate, negatively affect the value of our community, and we don't get it.
Well, the interesting enough, I was working in the early 90s, and that's what you ran into all the time. Now it's kind of there's a bit of the opposite, in that the horse is out of the barn. Like, everyone knows these places add value. And so, for example, we did a lot of work in this community in Stapleton in Denver, and now we're working in one in Aurora, which is more. That was the old airport, right? Stapleton. Exactly, yeah, and it was very successful in this and that. But then the next community over, it just finished, Aurora, which is more of a less economically prosperous place. They loved the idea coming in because they just know that it was going to feed the tax base and it was going to help pay for the schools and the roads. So there is this, and so for the ADUs specifically, we were trying to get it into our very tiny lots, 42 by 100, and they bent over backwards. They were basically asking us, what do you need to build them, simply because they knew this was going to bring in revenue into their community. So this is the sort of the business end of what we try to do. We try to do beauty and this and that. And then everyone sort of says, oh, you're sort of in the clouds with beauty. Well, beauty sells. I mean, when someone comes in and they see a building and they fall in love, and, you're the architect, you're like, job done. Yeah, we can fix the bathrooms. We can make sure it sheds properly. We can do everything right. But if they don't have that emotional connection, it's just another commodity to them.
Right. I often say that, the spaces between the buildings become more important than the buildings themselves. So what is the streetscape? The things you touch and feel. What does the door knocker feel like? What does it feel like when you open up that gate, where you're going from public to semi-public to private? Things about, we know in new urbanism why it works, like porches and things like that. There was a book that came out in the early 70s called Defensible Space by Oscar Neumeier, I think was the guy's name. And it talked about, in Bedford-Stuyvesant and in Brooklyn and Harlem, about the importance of the stoop. I mean, being a New York guy, and the layering of where you can communicate with someone walking down the street while you're sitting on your rocking chair on the porch, or people culturally in these very dense urban poorer communities, their social network was on the street, and it was sitting on the stoop, and it was having conversations with people. And that there's a lot of lessons about those kinds of places that you can apply today to building new communities, or blending in with established communities, that you take this kit of parts, and it's the fence, it's the gate, it's the street light, it's the human scaled elements that you touch and feel. And that this assemblage, just like in pattern books, when some of the great residential architecture was done from pattern books, all these things work well together. About 18 years ago, I did a primer for the revitalization of downtown Edgartown that I did for free, and I gave it to the town as a guideline about how you could, change the aluminum door on a storefront, do object signs, do brick sidewalks, do planters, do human scale exterior lighting, have the first 10 feet of a shop be with incandescent or halogen lighting, not fluorescent lighting. And I went through the whole community in the commercial district, and I went every single building, as simple as like changing an aluminum to a wooden storm door, or get rid of the tinted glass in the aluminum frame and put a wood frame and clear glass. And over the last 35 years, I'm happy to report that a significant amount of the things that we put into the guidelines have been executed. So the Edgartown of today is so significantly better, not only in the residential architecture, but the merchandising mix. One of the things I learned when I was with Ben Thompson and worked on Faneuil Hall Marketplace was we took the calendar 365 days a year, day and night, and then how do you animate a place? And at the same time, when they were looking to lease out the commercial spaces in Faneuil Hall, the merchandising mix was predetermined. Like, let's go find this particular shop. Let's go find this particular, surf shop if it was in Edgartown. So the idea of predetermining the goods and services that a community needs and where they might be best placed within the fabric of the community really enriches people's lives, but at the same time creates an identity for that community that people enjoy, not only from the people that live there, but the tourists, which is important to the economy of that particular island. So there's lots of lessons along the way about how to animate a space, and the buildings become kind of the backdrop. In Japan, there's a system of maps where you can determine the size of a square, where you can recognize the face of an individual across the square, and that's an intimate outdoor space. And if that's framed by so many mats high of a building, there's a system that we can use as architects to test ourselves about how do you create these wonderful spaces, or elements of delight. Turn the corner and you go down a little hallway and it opens up to a square or something. So how you can do that. There was a wine bar in Munich some years ago. My son was living with a host family in Germany. He said he's a product designer, and he said that German is the language of design, so he wanted to go live and learn German. So I was visiting with him, and I went to this little wine place, like 14 seats, around 5:30, and people started coming in. It was snowing outside. Wonderful little streetscape, and there was a little narrow hallway at the back going to the bathrooms, and dimly lit little vaulted ceiling. People keep coming in. I said, they're all going to the bathroom. What are they doing? Well, at the end of the hallway was a door, and that all these buildings, the backs of the buildings all faced an open space that had a glass roof on it. And there were all these cafes and restaurants that had this communal environment behind these 300, 400-year-old buildings. And the only way to get to the space was through these other places. And it was this incredible delight that you would never experience had you not been a little more inquisitive and go beyond the bathroom. But those little elements and the things you walk on, when we did Faneuil Hall, this is before computers, so we hand drew all those cobblestones and all those pavers and all those things. I did it with this. This is my computer still to this day. But you really start to develop this understanding of cadence and pace and scalability that really is the backbone of architecture.
It's interesting that you talked earlier about the porch, because that was a part of a question that I was going to ask a little later. Is that, Jane Jacobs taught us this, like in The Death and Life of
That's right.
American Cities 50 years ago, that when the porches started to break down on the urban cities, then they lost eyeballs and streets became unsafe. And
That's
it was directly related to exactly what you were talking about. It was that communal thing. You had dinner, you sat on your porch, you talked to your neighbors, and you protected. You're part of a family. And we've become, at least I think it's starting to change back. And certainly areas like Nantucket, the Sconset, or all over the Vineyard, where it's about community. But for the last 20 or 30 years, we've gone this insular, I have to find the door, I don't know how to, I'm not welcome, the no feng shui. And that has to change. It's like the porch.
Well, in suburbia, the garage doors become your portal to your home 90% of the time. And that's what's in suburbia. I mean, that's often what is the primary dominant element on the streetscape, is the 3-car garage doors stuck in the front of their house, and that half the time the doors are open because that's how people come in and out. And it really, doesn't really lend itself to quality architecture. And the sequential nature of how you arrive at a place and how you experience it, how if it's a larger piece of land, how do you create that alley of trees that you drive through? We go back to the Great Gatsby and the East Egg and West Egg, and you think about when we do these larger homesteads, what's the sequential nature of how you have this sense of arrival. And then when you open up the front door, it's a big chunky door with a great door knocker or a great handle from Rocky Mountain or something like that. Then you can look through the house, and that there's this spine that draws you through out to the porch, and then on to, if it's a garden or a pool or whatever it may be. And then at the end of that green space, there's another object, be it a guest house or a cabana or something that draws you through the house. And how you create this circulation pattern off of a spine, and maybe it's in 2 directions. It really helps explain how people can move through spaces.
I tell clients all the time is that the integration between the architecture and the landscape architecture, they're just all rooms that are open to each other. So that's to your point. You walk in that door and you're already looking through rooms, and you're looking outside at rooms. And then eventually you may find a folly or something, the way you arrive and then you turn around and you look at where you came from. It's all this beautiful path that's been designed by 2 different people for around one party.
That's right. That's right. We do a lot of our projects. We have landscape architects on, and early on, I tend to write the narrative or the script, like a book or a movie. So I script my houses. So the story I just told about my own house in Edgartown that I made up, I'll do that on every project. And so it helps the client say, okay, if this was the cottage by the sea, that was a family homestead, that was your great uncle's, and the hurricane in 1938 came through, which is based on reality, it did, and all the windows were blown out and the house was kind of abandoned, and then you inherited it. And so you want to tell that narrative, and then what would be the door knocker that you would have had on that house then? What would the cabinetry have looked like if it was a 1930s or 1920s construction? And did it have wavy glass in the upper pantry cabinets? So there are ways in which we can help the client better understand the goals and objectives of what we're trying to do with, historically motivated architecture, without being a museum, but having these cues about patina, how to create new patina in new construction that really serves the character and theme of what we're trying to create. You can do the beach house, you can do shabby chic. It doesn't have to be, great architecture. It should be simple. And yet the furniture should come from Brimfield Fair, and it should be, a collection of funky things, if that's the notion of the quintessential summer of 42 beach house. So you can apply it to, simple architectural approaches, or much more layered and more carefully crafted and thought out as well.
David, I don't want to totally interrupt the lovely arc of questioning that you have sort of set up for Patrick with this question, but it's just burning. I know, Patrick, you spend a lot of time around academia and with academics, and probably people who can think about architecture in substantially different ways from what you're describing, right. And who I don't know if this is a straw man or if you tell me if this is what you encounter, but I would just imagine that you receive a lot of pushback from certain ilk of people who think about architecture when you tell them that you sort of build upon this narrative every time. Do you, and how do you engage with that?
Well, as we chatted earlier, I'm very involved with the architecture school where I went at Syracuse University, and I'm on the advisory board, and I do a lot of workshops and scholarships, and I'm a trustee of the university, and I'm always the first one at our big trustee meetings to tell all the other trustees that, you know, with the entering classes of freshmen, the architecture school students always have the highest SATs and the highest GPAs. And Syracuse is always within the top 5 architecture undergraduate degree programs in the country, and that the university needs to celebrate that, as opposed to one university. And so I'm always selling the architecture school. But you're right. There are schools like Notre Dame that you know that are more classically inspired, and in the more recent past, Miami in Florida, which has now kind of changed their program to be something a little different. But for many years, Catholic University also had a classical program. There were other schools that featured that. But what I try to say is, you can do modern architecture that's still warm and inviting, and that's not machine. It's not the Bauhaus. It's not Walter Gropius, even though I worked for the Architects Collaborative for 5 years. In a time when some of the original partners were still practicing back in the early 70s. So, I mean, that was a unique and wonderful opportunity that I had. And again, I was trained as a modernist, you know, back in, I went to architecture school. So, and I sit in on thesis juries and things like that, you know, with 5th-year students and graduate students. And I say, you know, the narrative approach in scripting can apply to a variety of architectural themes and styles. It's really about using that device as a way in which your clients can get on the same page with you early on. And then as the project evolves, and then if there are interior designers that come in that might be looking to do something very different than the 2 years you've been working on your house. And, you know, it's the bane of my existence sometimes. But the point is, go back to the script and say, well, in the beginning, this is what we talked about. We talked about a village. We want to create, like on some of these larger homes we do, it's really more like a village and a homestead. And we wanted to create a hierarchy of, you know, big house, small house, baby house, or a barn or outbuilding. Excuse me. And so, like for example, Newell Jacobson's work, which, you know, he recently passed, but his son is carrying it in the firm. I mean, those little Monopoly white boxes are incredibly well detailed. They're all the same. It's the same simple bookcase. There's, you know, the gutters are integrated, which I don't think really works so well. The house is going to leak. But this notion of, I don't care if it's in the Caribbean or if it's on Martha's Vineyard or if it's in Washington, D.C., it's always about village. It's taking those Monopoly pieces and how you assemble them, that he creates these village-like elements that tell the story of how you want to live in this house. You kind of force the way you live in these houses that he does. Now, they're very sculptural, and I happen to like them a lot because they're really great scale. They're human scale, and I think they're wonderful. But I'm not so sure they're going to last so long. Just some of the details I question in if you're living in a New England environment and you have snow and weather and rain, and kind of forcing the issues of moisture penetrations into your walls and things like that. But, you know, everything is flush. There's 2 layers of plaster. All the baseboards are flush. The doors are flush. You know, everything is just beaded. It looks simple, but it costs more money to do. And, you know, baseboard and crown molding hide the ills, you know, and you don't have that. So everything's got to be on the money. And it's not for everybody. You know, God forbid you need to put curtains up. You know, it's like, you know, it's a Richard Meyer house, but invented in a more humanistic scale. So I always liked his work when I was an architecture student. And what my takeaway was really about taking the bigger programs and breaking it into smaller pieces. And then having moved to the Boston area after graduate school, all of New England architecture is based on that. And houses were added on over time, but always the original house was the dominant element. And I think some architects that are much more modernist in their thinking, and even to the architectural standards that people apply, saying that if you do new architecture, it should not relate to the old architecture. It should be entirely different. Now, I don't subscribe to that, but the Department of the Interior Standards speaks to that specifically. So then what happens is you may get this super duper glass box or something attached to a federal colonial, and you're getting your tax credits or whatever it may be, but that is forever tainting what probably should have been more respected. So
Interesting is that I was hosted or helped host a lecture years back with Bobby McAlpine.
Yep.
We started talking about the standards themselves, and at the time I was on a historic district commission. I believe I was still on it, and I asked the question to a room of, I think it was like 400 people or something. It was a lot, all architects, and I said, if you had a choice of the most successful house that you ever built in your career, and it was going to get added on to after you were dead, would you want it to be different, or would you want it to be the same and matching? And every single hand wanted it to be matching. So like, if every single architect doesn't care, but I get it that you want to change little nails in the whole thing, again, being on a historic district, but yeah, that was a misguided
right. So David, for example, my house in Wellesley is a 1936 Royal Barry Wills house. Okay, not Richard Wills, bless his soul, Royal Barry Wills, much better architect. I've done 5 major additions on the house over the last 35 years. It's totally seamless. You can't tell. I built a barn. I built 2 carriage houses, freestanding. I've done 5 additions on the house. And I said to myself, if Royal Barry Wills was given the bigger program, what would he have done? And so my house is one of the most loved houses in the community. It's quintessential Currier and Ives 101. But, you know, if I add up all the square footage of all the pieces, it's probably 20,000 square feet of stuff. But it tells the story and the narrative of another time. And my neighborhood is called Wellesley Farms, which was built out in mostly the 30s and the 40s with good architecture. Royal Barry Wills had probably done 100 houses. I've now done about 100, but you can't tell. You really can't tell the new. And it's non-ego driven architecture. It's really about understanding the scale, but also understanding what the original architect had in mind. And I don't care if it's somebody else, but what was that architecture that was special? Now, this house sat on the market for a number of years, and I benefited from that because it was up on a hill. There was a little 1930s garage at the bottom of the hill. The suburban housewife could not get her groceries up to the house unless she had to walk through a series of steps through 2 stone walls. So it just sat on the market, and the price kept getting lower and lower and lower. And I was able to acquire it, you know, in 1989 or so for, you know, a good value. And over all these years, I added on to it, but I did it in a way that respected not only the hierarchy and the scale, but what the original architect would have done. Now, the exception was I pushed out the front door, and I was really nervous about this. So I replaced the front door, and I did a gabled piece, and I introduced a rounded front door that this house never had. And I was really concerned that I was going to screw this up. So I did models. I know I'm looking at your models behind you, and I did models, and I studied it, and I was pretty sure it was going to be okay. And I found a company in Montreal that makes the same swirl siding from the 30s with little bark on the edge. I found the quarry in Connecticut that made the original stone on the face of the house. I matched the stone. I matched the wood lintels. I matched the swirl siding. I took off the asphalt roof and put the hand split red cedar roof back on the house. I added a couple of chimneys in the additions, and I matched the stone in the same tall extra chimneys. So the roadmap was already there. I just had to say, well, with the bigger program and having raised 5 kids, I needed a bigger house. But I really wanted to preserve the integrity of the streetscape. And for that, I think many, many people love what I've done, and I've been given a lot of other work to do in that immediate neighborhood based on the success of the understated approach to the architecture.
Yeah, I think there's a component of what you're talking about, which to me sounds like a visual logic. So that, you know, if you're in an area and if they built in the past and they built the big house and they built the next house, some of those were limited by the lumber they could get, what would hold, what wouldn't. But what that did over the years was create this visual DNA. And so that when you come along and you want to build a house, everyone's sort of the back of their brain is already sort of educated by what that area feels like and what it is, so that when you use that language, that you employ the same visual logic, that when they look at that, it does feel right. You know, it does. And another aspect I remember from my school years is I went to a modernist school and had a hard time with professors there. And they would say, oh, that's just historicist junk. But when you were talking about those Bedford-Stuyvesant townhouses, it's not just a particular style or a particular this, it's all these lessons on how to layer space, on how to create defensible space, on how to create views. So when they threw out learning from history, whether it be a village compound of a homestead or a urban row house or whatever it be, they're losing the lessons in composition that you could have learned to then employ with a modernist language if you wanted, and with any language. So they've really done, I mean, that's where all these pattern books and new urbanist communities have come from, because there's this dearth of people that aren't educated to see things the way the historical landscape has built them over the centuries.
Right. I mean, if you don't know history, you really don't know anything.
Right.
So, I mean, that's one of the mantras I use as well. So you really need to understand how to create a sense of place. And that sense of place can be defined by your community, your block, your street, and your house. And then within your own house, if we're talking residential, how do you create that sense of warmth and shelter? And it doesn't have to be traditional architecture per se, but you know, what are the materials? Like there are a lot of new materials that look like wood that are not wood on commercial buildings that are really helpful. And so when you look at some of the newer materials that are out there, there are certain materials that really talks about the quality of a space that can be enhanced by, you know, materials that are warm and inviting, things you touch and feel. So, you know, I tested myself very much so on this modern house that we recently did in Chilmark, and it's a house and it's a modern barn guest house combo, and the client really, you know, I kept saying to him, I interviewed 4 times to do the job, and the last time I turned him down. I said, you know, come on, go get somebody else, and here's somebody I would highly recommend. You know, why do you keep coming back to me? And he said, I really like the way you think. And so then I said, okay, I'll tell you what. Let's have a discourse on what you think is modern and why you want a modern house. And now let's look at the zoning, because zoning dictates design. If you wanted a flat roof high house in Chilmark, it has to be 14 feet tall. So that's not what you want. So you need to have a roof, which you can go to 18 feet tall. And then you say, okay, well, does that mean you have to build a ranch house? No. It's the average mean grade of existing. And on a slope site, you can cut into the hill, you can take advantage of that. You can create a house that's 26 feet tall in an 18-foot zone if you work carefully with the land, which is what we did. But let's look at the European model of a more modern house. And I said, you know, if we go to Belgium, there's some examples that have houses that are modern, that were probably done in the 40s, but the use of materials are warm and inviting. And this sequential nature of coming to the grand country house is something that we should be considering and applying, and how to create those alleys of trees and uplight the trees, and how to have really tall volumes inside the house, but not being reflected on the outside of the house. Take the floor joists and set them into the foundation so you can get a 10-foot ceiling height, but not have a 10-foot exterior wall express. So using these devices in a way that keeps the intimacy and scale and the perception on the outside, but then creates these interesting volumes, which is what he was looking for in a modern house. So it was a good process and a really great result. And I'm glad I didn't turn him down.
Well, it's funny because you mentioned in your title, you mentioned contemporary living. And so on one hand, that you would assume that talks about the fact that Royalbury Wills houses didn't have family rooms. So you need to take that. And like you said, I'm going to pretend I'm Royalbury Wills and I'm going to renovate the house. And I have to figure out how the kitchen needs to be a little bit bigger and it needs a family room. But so you have the sort of the spatial aspect of how things change and contemporize. But there's also the aspect of reinterpreting or modernizing traditional detailing, which is just exploring with the canons that sometimes there are nuances. I tell the stories. I had the opportunity to go to Edwin Lutyens' only building in America, the embassy in Washington, D.C., the British Embassy. And I walked through with two other architects, and we literally walked around saying, I wouldn't let this off the drawing boards. That's how crazy it is. And it was so beautiful. He was experimenting with these traditional details that were at a genius level. And so I'm sure that you have both aspects. You have modernizing for spatial, but you also look at the nuance of things that look on the face of it very traditional and historic, but they aren't at all. They've been rethought and rethought out and modernized.
And, you know, we have the use of, you know, nano doors and doors that pocket and things like that, that getting that indoor outdoor living experience that people really want. So like on the Royalbury Wills house, I had to keep the plates the same from the outside, but I would step the floors down. Like every time I had the kitchen or the family room, I'd step the floors down, and at the same time make a cathedral ceiling. So those dormers on the outside, there's no floor there, but you get the volumes on the interior because the original part of the house is 7'2" ceiling height, you know, in the living room, which I don't mind, but it's not a good marketing thing, you know. So every time I did an addition, I would step the floors down. You step down, you know, 18-inch wide with a 4.5-inch rise, and you have 3 of those so that you could start to get more volume. And then if the additions didn't have a room above it, you were able to get more volumetric nature, like in the kitchen and the family room and the breakfast room and things like that. But the outside story and the language is that these are secondary wings on a house that's already pretty petite to start off with. So it's like going to the Cotswolds almost, you know, and every house is shrunken and shrunken and shrunken. So that was the trick and how I did that.
I'm very, I love what you say about not wanting to be visible anywhere in the work. That's my approach also. Nobody really cares about the architect. They want to live their life and they want things to be, in general, they want it to be harmonious. I mean, the thing about the visual logic is I wanted to tie it to how we all dress or how we, you know, organize a room. You go about it unconsciously. You don't say, okay, my glasses are nice and crooked and this shirt clashes beautifully with my pants. You just very simply, you know, unconsciously tidy yourself up to present yourself in public. Granted, you know, you might be of the personality type that likes a lot of attention, and there's a place for those buildings also. But if you analog us into buildings into, you know, human society, you'll find that it's a very natural response to want something to harmonize, to fit well, to work well together. And I think that's what traditional communities that were, you know, almost entirely lived in the public realm. That's why those buildings, those areas look so beautiful, because if you're always living in the public realm, you don't want to be obnoxious. You don't want to be, you want to be loved. I mean, not necessarily loved, but at least liked. And so when you build in that way, you get the result that what you're saying, it's the same as acting out in society.
Right. No, I agree. Except David's a much better dresser than I am. So
Good.
he's a much more
Stop that.
stylized.
Stop that.
Much more stylized. I don't even own a bow tie.
But you have the personality. That's why we're a good combo at the bar.
That's right. That's right. But you're right. I mean, that's the lesson that I keep trying to tell my clients, you know, wherever we're practicing, is really, if you want to be loved in the community, you really need to be paying attention to scale, materials, and if there's an opportunity to create a delight that the whole community can share in, be it even the view to a garden or the view to the harbor, and not obliterate that, or create on a more commercial building, create public access to the waterfront. When we did the Atlantic Boathouse building on the end of Main Street in Edgartown, there was no public access to the waterfront. So we created a public restaurant, widened the sidewalks, sidewalk cafe, public access around the building to the waterfront. So in doing that, we're enriching not only the viability of the restaurant, but also the people that will come to Edgartown and experience the harbor. And the place. So I think we as architects really should take on that responsibility of the greater good responsibility of saying, what does the public realm need? And how can we enhance the public realm's experience on this project? And for that, oftentimes there are incentives. You know, if you animate the streetscape, you might get an extra floor like in New York City or things like that. But the other reason to do it is to really say, how can I improve the public realm in a way that celebrates what this place is all about? And really, I think we as architects really need to understand what is it that the community we're about to go in is all about. And as I said, you know, we're doing work in, I've got 3 projects in British Columbia, in Canada. And we're doing one, a large home and outbuildings and guest house and on a significant parcel in an area called Oak Bay in Victoria, which is the most British of all Canada. And I had to go in front of the design review board, which consisted of the dean of the architecture school, University of Victoria, and 4 other architects, all Canadian architects. And here I am, the American architect, about to do probably one of the larger, significant projects in the last 100 years in this community on the waterfront. And we were taking down a house that had been really bastardized in the 50s and so on. And I was really concerned, one, being an American architect practicing in British Columbia, although I did get licensed there. And so I really studied the community and how it grew over time, and what was the impetus for this community, which was a summer community for wealthy people on the coast. And these grand cottages, not like Newport that big, but pretty significant homes were built in the 20s and 30s. And the covenants and the guidelines that were created back then, I really studied. So I spoke for about 45 minutes. Again, it was on Zoom because of COVID, so you don't really see the audience. But I spoke about the community to get the board to understand that I understood what this was about. And then I slowly unveiled the presentation of what we were trying to do and why. And then there was silence. And I was like, oh boy, and my client was listening. And the chairman, you know, older guy than I, you know, spoke and said, well, Mr. Ahearn, I'm like, here we go. I must commend you. You have captured the essence of what our community is all about. And this building will definitely hold the test of time. Well done. And then everybody else kind of nicely fell in line. But, you know, if you don't know the history of place, you're shooting in the dark, and what you may come up with may not be the right solution. It may not be successful for the client in terms of how they could be loved in the community, but you really need to do that. You really need to know. And, we do work everywhere. So, we're doing these 3 projects in Utah. We have Newport Beach, California, Maryland, Ohio, Traverse City, Michigan. We just did a house up there a couple of years ago. And also try to get to understand the local tradesmen, because not everybody can do the same kind of details. What we do in Canada, for example, they take 1.5 inches of lightweight concrete, they put it on all their floors, no matter what. I'm like, why do we do that? I don't get it. Well, that's the running joke when we get on our job site meetings on Zoom. Where's the 1.5 inch concrete? Did it arrive yet? Because that's the general practice. They do out insulation more than they do cavity insulation, which then your exterior details on a shingled house have to change significantly. So local trade technology oftentimes, creates a different kind of architecture. So, and materials. We did a house in Cherry Hills outside of Denver, and they wanted a New England vernacular house. We shipped by railroad car to Denver, New England fieldstone, because I couldn't get it in Colorado. They don't make it there. They don't have it there. So that sense of authenticity, if that's what someone wants, you need to explain to them, well, it's going to cost more. But if that's what you want, I think we can do that for you.
Patrick, after having, spoken with you for an hour, it's become quite clear to me that, your success must be attributable to some large percentage of your capability as a communicator.
Yes.
How would you, if you had to break it down to 100%, how much of your success is due to your skill as a designer, which is obvious and clear, and how
The project didn't move forward, but Howard kept the model. So now this is like back in 1977 or something like that. Move ahead 40 years or 50 years later on Martha's Vineyard. And I designed this boathouse club on the waterfront. And one of the club members, who's also an architect, but he's really developed, works for the related companies, Hudson Yards and all that stuff, of which Howard was the architect on. So the guy comes over to me and he says, and I'm having dinner, I think it was my wife's birthday, and a family, we took over one of the semi-private rooms. And the guy comes to me and he says, somebody wants to come over and say hello to you that you haven't seen in a long time. And it was Howard. Howard took over the room. And he told the story that I just told. And he said that, that I was one of his most talented people that he ever came across, and he still had the model on his desk at Elkus Manfredi to this day. And so I never saw anybody that was such a good storyteller as Howard, and how he approached architecture in this way of storyline and scripting. And I emulated that. And when I was asked by the Boston Society of Architects to apply for a fellowship in the AIA, I went to Howard as my sponsor. And he was my sponsor. And he was going to write the foreword of my book. And then he went down to Florida. I saw him on lunch. I had lunch with him on Wednesday. He went to Florida on Friday, and then didn't wake up. And he was doing the whole city place in West Palm Beach, and all of the lessons that we had collectively learned together. But those two people really were the most important people, other than two others at Syracuse. Kermit Lee was my design studio professor. First African-American architect from Syracuse. And I learned so much about context and place and scale from him. And this other professor I had, who was head of the redevelopment corporation in Philadelphia. He'd come up one day a week to teach this guy, George von Scheven. And I took an urban design studio with him in graduate school. And he really taught me some of the things we've been talking about today. But in my daily practice, the art of knowing how to sell an idea, I think, is critical to be successful, particularly recognizing that the boards you have to go to in front of are not educated. So many times I'll go in a zoning board of appeal presentation, and I know I'm going to get crucified if I don't learn how to win over these 5 members of the board. And I usually know going in which is going to work and which is not. And I tell my clients. And I had a filibuster. Robert's Rules of Order, once I own the floor, I own the floor. And I'll talk for 2 hours. And I might not even get to the design yet because I need to wear them down. And I like to go last. So oftentimes on the Back Bay Architectural Commission, when I was doing a lot of work in the Back Bay, I've done over 400 buildings in the Back Bay. If I was first or second, I would defer to the next meeting. And I always wanted to go last. And it makes a difference. If we interview for a project, I mean, I don't do that very often. Usually we just get work. But in the days that I would interview for a project, I always wanted to go last for lots of reasons. And so one of the things I do with the Syracuse Architecture School on these Ahearn workshops is really talk about how to be the most important person in the room. You need to know, not only do you need to know zoning codes, and every place is different, but you need to find the gray, because there's lots of gray in zoning codes. So if you can find the gray, like how you calculate the height of a building on average mean grade, and if you can sink the whole land down, it's average mean grade from what was existing. And if you cleared out the site, now I did a 3-story house in an 18-foot height restriction in Chilmark, and the building inspector said to me, "You're going to kill me here. I'm going to get so many calls on this." I said, "Lenny, is there anything I'm doing here that's illegal or not correct?" He says, "No, you're right, but I'm going to get the calls." I said, "Well, fasten your seatbelt. That's all I can tell you." So architects need to really be creative in their thinking. They're trained to be creative in their thinking. They're trained to sell ideas through the design studio process. But you need to have more than that. You need to know context. You need to know community. If you're doing a retail project, you need to know the product. Not so much now, but I did a lot of retail project stuff and out of the outgrowth of my work with Nathaniel Hall in my own practice. And how to do participatory retail, how to engage people to celebrate a place. And there's so many good examples in Europe that we can learn from, and about scale and about public spaces. In Newbury Street in Boston, when I first came to Boston, there were no restaurants, there were no cafes. And one of the first restaurant buildings we did was a place called Sansi on Newbury Street down towards Mass Ave. And it was an old stable building. And I had to go in front of the Neighborhood Association, the Back Bay, and the Back Bay Architectural Commission. So we designed this stable building with all these doors that we showed. We got through the Architectural Commission, the Neighborhood Association, new liquor license from the community. Opening day, I opened up and folded all the doors away, which are now known as Sansi doors, took all the tables and chairs and faced them on the street. It was right on the sidewalk. The facade was right on the sidewalk. And the Neighborhood Association went ballistic. The Architectural Commission went ballistic, said I snookered them. And I said, here's the drawings, here's the doors. The fact that I showed them closed, but I said operable doors, it's not my fault you can't read the drawings. And that restaurant has not changed in 40 years. That is probably one of the most iconic cafe bistro restaurants in the city of Boston. And then we went on and on and on Newbury Street. I convinced the real estate guys who owned the buildings where you're getting no rent for the basements. How, if you cut down this from the sidewalk, cut down into the basement, you're going to get 2 first floors. and you're going to get $60 or $90 a square foot. And then you can have money to restore the rest of the buildings or add a floor in the back or whatever you're going to do. So looking at the real estate opportunities with a creative eye and saying, how can you maximize? If I went to the Back Bay Architectural Commission and I got a garage or an extra floor in a building, I got a kicker in my fee. Or if I could achieve a certain dollar per square foot on a condominium above their pro forma, I get a piece of the deal. So I was taking pieces of deals in condo conversions. I was developing buildings on my own, where I was the marketing person, the architect, the general contractor. And you know, after all these years, I've done over 400 buildings just in Back Bay alone. And so, you know, this mantra that architecture is a rich man's hobby and a poor man's profession is garbage. You know, I think I do quite well for myself. Maybe not as good as my Goldman Sachs, you know, clients, but I do just fine.
But how did you raise 5 kids then? While inhaling like a whale, the amount of work, it's truly impressive, but that's, everything is time, right? I mean.
Well, you know, I'm also quick. And very quick. I mean, right now, you know, we have 21 architects and we're doing 147 houses simultaneously all around the country.
Crazy.
But, you know, all my people, you know, we all drink the same Kool-Aid and, you know, nobody ever leaves. Everyone's with me. I don't know. Tardamella's been with me 18 years. Another guy, 17 years. Some guys, you know, close to 20 years. And, you know, we talk about brand. We talk about legacy. We talk about how architecture can make a difference and how architects should give back to the communities they practice in. I was, you know, chairman of the board for 4 years in the Preservation Trust. As you know, you went to the Carnegie when we were down there. I did the Carnegie building pro bono. I did Union Chapel restoration pro bono. I did the Fire Museum pro bono. You know, I believe in giving back to the communities. I make my people join the architectural commissions in their communities they live in, or the planning boards, or the zoning boards, or design review boards. Be engaged, be out there. Let your face as an architect be in the community. You know, talk about at the baseball game how architecture is important. Get out and make talks. Talk to people. Let them know that we're not this insular little enclave of monks that do these drawings and, you know, come out in the world and create these edifices and things. Be human. Be approachable. Speak normal English, not crintological delineation, epidermal cosmetology. You know, what did I just say? You know, well, it's about the front of the house. What do you think of the front of the house? You know, it's not the facade. Like, speak normal and, you know, and be approachable. And I think that's what I do with the videos and stuff. That's why I do that, because I want people to understand how architecture can really improve people's lives and embrace it. And one of the things we talked about earlier was it's really more about 98% of all the housing in the United States is designed by non-architects when you look across the whole country. So we as architects, in terms of residential construction, have very little impact. And we need to change that dynamic. And I think we can.
Well, how would you propose, I mean, since you're up there in Syracuse and all, and how would you get that common sense approach into the schools where it's almost like your intellectual heft is based on how, you know, how obtuse your language can be. And then that's, of course, a huge disservice because no one really understands that way of talking. But you're in a situation where you could, well, as you can see, I'm kind of begging you to go to school and teach students because there's so many intelligent, great architects.
I taught for free pro bono at the Boston Architecture Center for 6.5 years. So I did that. And you know, so when I opened up my own practice, I couldn't do that and still try to build the practice. But I do go back and I do talk. I mean, and I sit in on juries, you know, from graduate school design at Harvard or RISD, you know, locally in Syracuse. But So when I was in architecture school at Syracuse, and I had some friends that were at Cornell. And at the time, in the late 60s and early 70s, the language of architectural expression as it was spoken at Cornell was extremely obtuse. And there were new words that were being invented that I didn't even know what they were talking about. And having grown up in Levittown, Long Island, I can assure you there's no affected speech in my language. But I do think that architecture schools can really help people if they don't go down that path again. And I think most architecture schools are a little more up to date on being more realistic about what architecture is in the spoken word and not, you know, so obtuse. But, you know, there are still architects that I know that do very interesting, high quality, historically motivated residential work that, you know, they may have grown up in Brooklyn, but they're speaking the King's English. You know, I have some architect people I know that live on Beacon Hill, and you think that they're the cousin of the Queen of England. It's like, well, I don't think you need to do that, but if that makes you feel comfortable, then go ahead.
Well, let's say you were in a Cornell, wherever, Harvard, where, you know, they've got students that have really worked hard, they're very accomplished kids and all that, and they do this beautiful project, but to my eye, a lot of times it looks like graphic art. You know, it looks like something that you would put on your wall in your nice loft, and people would say, okay, this guy's got taste, but it has nothing to do with building, and it's nothing to do with how humans.
Well, yeah, well, I see that. I see that a lot, and like at thesis level, I did the thesis review recently. You know, in May at Syracuse, at graduate and undergraduate, 5-year and 6-year programs, and a lot of the thesis projects were very ethereal, not realistic, but, you know, it was an exploration on whatever it might have been. And the graphic presentations were analytiques, and they had, you know, pieces of things and things like that. That's okay, I guess, but when you go out and look for a job and that's your portfolio, you know, really not so hot. I mean, you know, we interview a lot of people from Notre Dame, and they do beautiful watercolors. And, you know, as an intern, that's great. You know, you could watercolor some of our stuff. That's great. But I really found that the design talent of taking a program, and if you get so engrossed in classicism, where you're basically building the Parthenon, and it's one big room, like, how do you do that and make it a house? You don't. So as much as I like that program, the reality of taking someone right out of school and trying to get them to be able to be meaningful in terms of your practice is hard. And one of the things about Syracuse that I like is that those students can actually get out of school and really be helpful in a practice and have learned enough. One of the issues we have with architectural education is that the 5-year undergraduate degree gold standard, you know, there's the National Council of Architectural Registration Boards, and there's only so many things you can change in electives in order to get that 5-year first professional degree. So I worked around that by doing these workshops. So it's not within the 5-year program, but it's something that you can apply to participate in. So I bring in a lot of different people, you know, people from related companies, developers, marketing strategy people, branding people that architecture students would never be exposed to. And that's my way of giving back and saying, you know what? I need to get people coming out of this university and this school of architecture that are going to learn a lot more from what I'm trying to do with these workshops than they would ever have learned in architecture school. And, you know, at 72 years of age, hopefully I'm going to be around a long time. I never plan on retire, but I don't want what I've learned all these years to be lost. So I think what I can do to help spread the word and how to practice in a different way, and also tell people, you know what? A lot of architecture students, even today, you know, money is a bad word. We don't want to talk about, you know, money, you know, that's not, we're architects, you know, we're architects and we don't make money, but we're the talent pool. And, you know, we go to cocktail parties and we pontificate about space and things. And, right. And yeah, right. Exactly. And, you know, well, that's garbage. And, you know, I think a lot of architecture schools throughout the country still take that mindset that, you know, it's not that long ago that the AIA would not allow you to advertise as an architect. I mean, maybe 20 years ago.
That's nuts.
Yeah. No, but that was the way it was. That was the way it was. You know, it was in the AIA canon of ethics that you cannot advertise. It was crazy. And that was in my time when I got out of school.
That's probably what one of the reasons no architects go and build their work. Builders are starved for someone to think logically, to solve problems, you know, everyday problems. And they say, okay, if you go there, you're basically a short order cook. Well, if you're a short order cook, still make it a delicious sandwich, you know, and still put whatever ingredients you want in it. And if more people that come through the door, guess what? Maybe you're not such a short cook anymore. Maybe you keep moving up. But there's all these opportunities. I mean, literally, you can design, everything is designed. When you walk around America, you're like, wait, didn't anyone design this? Yeah, they did, with like 3 arms tied behind their backs. So why don't you get in there and, you know, get some work instead of complaining about being a line worker on some big office building?
That's right. That's right. And I think what we have seen in the public realm in the last 20 years, a much more enlightened interest in design as a whole. And we think about, you know, furniture, lighting, you know, the iPhone, you know, the computers. Product design and industrial design and automobile design have really moved up in the forefront considerably in America in the more recent past. And that, you know, when Martha Stewart or you know, people are selling in the discount department stores quality design pieces like the, you know, the teapot that, you know, that what's his name did, and
Michael
stuff
Graves.
like Michael Graves. Things you use every day, things you touch and feel, people are more sensitized to. That's why I talk about the doorknob. The first thing you walk in your house, what does the doorknob look like? Is it a circle? Is it a ring? Is it chunky? How thick is the door? Things, the sensory experience. You know, the public realm, even if they know it or not, they are sensitized to that. And color, and how you use color, how you use texture, how you use materials. Fabric. I mean, David has really nice clothes and always dresses well. Far better than me. But, you know, I get 50% off at Vineyard Vines because I design their houses. So I get Vineyard Vines all the time. So, you know, I'm just saying, I think the future for architecture is really, really terrific. I think the future of our profession is really, really important. I think we can make significant contributions to society, but we need to be out there. We need to be talking about it. We need to be selling how important it is, and we need to do it in a way that's approachable.
Patrick, are you okay? Do you have another 10 or 15 minutes, or do you want to wind this down? I just don't want to go too far.
I'm all right. I'm all right.
So I need to start by both complimenting you and teasing you about your philosophy of interviewing last, because I recently was shortlisted to interview against you for a project in Newport, and you interviewed first, and the rest of the architects were not interviewed. You got the job. Congratulations. So
thank you. Yeah, and we're about to start construction. I know.
Yeah,
but you know, so we got interviewed to do a tear down. We were asked to come down and tear the house down. And I walked into the house and I said, there's no way we're going to tear this house down. And I said, I know how to make this program work. And, the construction manager, that was the entree, that we were coming down to tear this house down and build a new house. And I convinced the owner that's not what we should do. So.
Yeah. So getting back to the sort of the branding and getting design to the masses. I mean, on one hand, you have your book, which is the most beautiful book. If people don't have this coffee table book that sort of expresses the essence of New England and Martha's Vineyard and architecture. But it's obviously beautiful cars and beautiful books, and it's really sort of about a brand. Michael Tartamella, who you mentioned earlier, said once that you walk to get a cup of coffee and you get 3 jobs on the way back and forth. Right. In Edgartown. But I guess, which brings me back to sort of, you have this image of, again, helping the community, the philanthropist, but you also have this image that can be used at all levels. In other words, you can be used at the coffee book level, but it can also be used for an addition in the back, or a porch, or a garden, or general consulting, or, you know what, Patrick, I need a front door and I just want to talk to an architect. Would you just look at the front door for me? And the question is, that is what you do. I know that's what you do. And that's not how architects are perceived, right? They only, oh, it's not $1 million, I'm not interested. So how do we get that branding down to the masses?
Well, it's exactly what I do is, with social media today, use that as a vehicle because it's free. It has a huge reach. And, for example, when I first started working in Edgartown, what I did is in the local newspaper, the Vineyard Gazette, I sketched a little house of the week. I just made it up. It was a little like 3x5 pen and ink little sketch. I did a different house every week. Every Friday, the paper would come out and there'd be one of my little houses. People started cutting them out, putting them on the refrigerator, like collecting like baseball cards. And that first summer, I got 26 projects. It was the first time an architect ever advertised in a newspaper. And it was the first time that it was a little pen and ink, approachable little sketch. And it just was, Patrick Ahearn, architect, the phone number. I didn't even have an office back then. I was working out of my house. I wasn't even working there for that matter. So, I think you can all use social media, Instagram, Facebook, things like that, and say, or like I took it on my own. Like nobody asked me to do the primer for the revitalization of downtown Edgartown. I just did it, and I presented it to the planning board, and like, who the hell is this guy? He just moved here. Why? What is it? What is he trying to tell us to do? We're happy with the hardware store the way it is. What? And then I went into the Back Bay Architectural Commission when I first moved to Boston in 1973, and I sat in and listened. And I said, I'd like to volunteer. I said, well, no, you have to get nominated by somebody. And I said, well, okay. So then I called up the Boston Side Architects. I said, I'd like to get on the Back Bay Architectural Commission. Well, you need to get appointed by the mayor. I called the mayor's office. I said, I'd like to get on the Back Bay Architectural Commission. Kevin White was the mayor at the time. And he lived on Beacon Hill. And I walked past his house for like 2 weeks trying to figure out when I could run into him, like by accident. And I ran into him. And he looked like my father, this kind of ruddy Irish looking guy. And I said, you look just like my dad. And he said, well, who's your dad? And I said, well, he lives in New York, but he's a crane operator, but And I said, I just moved to Boston in the Back Bay. And I hear that, the mayor appoints people to the Back Bay Architectural Commission. He says, yeah. I said, well, I'd like to do that. He said, well, what's your credentials? I said, well, I got a Master of Architecture and a Bachelor of Architecture, and I'm living in a basement apartment for $125 a month in the Hare Krishna building. That's my credentials. And he said, okay, go see Bob Ryan at the Boston Redevelopment Authority. And he was the head of it at the time. And I did. And he said, well, okay, the mayor says I should talk to you. And I did. and I got the appointment. I also ended up selling a condo in one of the buildings I did some years later to Bob Ryan and his wife. And ended up owning a house around the corner from Kevin White on the flat of Beacon Hill too. So he became my neighbor. And so it's those kinds of things. You really need to be able to put yourself forward and really take a chance. Take a chance and talk to people. You know, for example, just about a month ago, there was a celebration in Weston, the town of Weston, here for 350 years of Weston, and they just redid all the sidewalks. Not very well done. Spent $30 million and doing some streetscape work. Not very well done, but it was a catalyst. So I was asked by one of the, actually a client of mine who was on the 350 board to do a talk. So I did a talk on architecture and place and these kinds of things to anybody who just showed up. And so 50 people showed up on a Saturday, and I spoke at the basement of the Catholic Church on architecture on a Saturday. No one's paying me to do it. I had a client say, I think people might be interested in what you have to say. One of the select women who was there, she said, would you be willing to have this kind of a talk again to the members of our select board and the planning board in Weston? Because, and I was fairly critical about, this was only a beginning, this was not an end. You know, you need to get your merchandising mix right. You need to get more animation. You need to bring more people downtown. You need, instead of these one-story buildings, you need to get apartments on top of things. You know, you got these 40B projects trying to come down your throat, but you need density. You need people living downtown. All these things that everybody knows, us architects know, but lay people don't get it. So I'm going to go talk to those different boards in September. You know, the town of Deering Harbor in Shelter Island, they want me to help them write their architectural guidelines for their 46 house community in Shelter Island. And I went down there and I met with them. I did a walking tour, 3.5 miles of every house, met with 30 people that live in the community or own homes there. And I'm helping them rewrite and actually write their guidelines to help that community and not just have houses torn down, because they can wait a year and tear them down. And there's some significant homes that are being torn down that will forever change that community. So again, giving back. And I don't even have a house on Long Island. I hadn't been to Long Island in 20 years. So nice ferry ride though, that was good.
So we have a question. Why do you think modern architects and urbanists keep relying on approaches that clearly fail to address real life need for the sake of innovation, instead of looking at successful models of the past and innovate those? That's from Isabella at your office.
Oh, Isabella, she's supposed to be drawing something I need. Lauren caught it.
She's caught.
She's caught. Jesus. Yeah, I told her I needed it by the end of the day too. So
sorry,
anyway,
Isabella.
Okay, so I think one of the things that architecture school does for people is, by the nature of being the creator, a lot of architects become egomaniacs, or they think that they know better than the layperson, or they know better than the client, or they want to sell. Like, I know architects that have a particular signature style on a window that they'll put in every single house they do, no matter where it is or what the orientation is or anything, because that's their idiom, that's their shtick. So in some architects, are really interested in, architecture as a machine, which goes back to the Bauhaus. And that the more detailed they make their nuts and bolts and things like that, and how they're expressed in their timber frame or this or that, it may not be the right scale, it might be the wrong proportions, the building might not feel right, it might overpower the streetscape. But if the machine-esque nature of the building form is something that they're known for, like there's some great architects, in the Northwest that do beautiful buildings and beautiful architecture. but maybe not always the right scale. So, I mean, architects that I really, really respect, but sometimes they lose the sensibility of scale and place. And that's where I think we as architects need to check ourselves. Like for example, the model behind you, you know, I know it's one of your nicer houses that I happen to like, but there's a lot of stuff going on there. And so you've got the cupola on the top, then you got the gable, then you've got, you know, a lot of stuff going on there. And, you know, who's driving the bus? It's a big program, a lot of architecture. I'm not quite sure the orientation of the neighbor. Oh, it was one of the doodads fell off, you know.
You're getting credit, David, like when you.
Well, I've been looking at it for the last hour and I didn't
Get
know.
him.
You know, we don't build them out of cardboard anymore. It's on SketchUp.
I know.
It's
I have
unfortunate.
I have a couple white models still laying around myself. But you know, sometimes I'll turn down the job. I had this very, very wealthy guy, a Greek guy, that spent a huge amount of money on a parcel of land on the Vineyard. And he wanted to do this big compound. And you know, I had dinner with him. He gave me a huge retainer just to start thinking about it. And I spent about 6 weeks thinking and came up with some sketches. And it's in an area that I've done other houses in their design review and their covenants and so on. And I go down and meet with him at his castle on the Hudson, and dead silence. He says, you know, Patrick, I'm Greek and I like glass and I like curves and I like this. And I said, well, Dean, the covenants don't really allow that to happen, you know? No, you don't worry about that. You come back and you draw what I tell you. Well, make a long story short, I went back, second design idiom, still didn't really like it. And I gave him his retainer back and I said, I can't help you. 10 years go by. Last summer, I get the call again. I hadn't done anything with the property. Can you meet with me, please? I said, come on. We've had this conversation. Have you learned anything in the last 10 years? Yes, please meet with me. I think I'm ready. I think I get it. I go meet with him. And after an hour, I realized he didn't get anything different. The builder he wanted to use said he wouldn't do it unless I was the architect. Because he had some architect in the Midwest that had done some other commercial work for him that had drawn something that was so alien to the island that it would never have gotten approved through the Concom or whatever. So he was hoping to use me as the front to get the approval and then, you know, have his other guy do all the construction drawings. And I said, no, I don't need the practice and I don't need the work, but no, thank you. You know, at this point in my career, I can do that. You know, I've been through 6 recessions. So in the old days, I was doing the decks and the dormers and everything else just to keep the food on the table. So, you know, I remember those days all too well. So Isabella, is that a good answer? I could talk to you at 6.
So I have another question. I don't know. They're looking for advice on how to prepare battle. We've gone to battle against an opportunistic developer who wanted to build homes which violate every architectural principle that you've espoused in the town of Wellesley, Pond Road. So we're going to bring you right into this one.
There we go.
Unfortunately, the planning board's hands were tied and the developer doesn't give about the greater good. What can residents do to protect themselves from such travesties in the future?
Well, having done tons of work in Wellesley and live in Wellesley, and you know, we have if a house is older than 1948, there's a 1-year demolition delay. That's it. So they can wait the year, and Pond Road is one of the nicest scenic ways in Edgartown. I mean, in Wellesley. It's behind Wellesley College. It's I think it's 1.5 acre zoning, and it's this country lane that looks up above the pond at Wellesley College. It's a very special streetscape, and a lot of it might have to do with if it's a spec house. I assume it's a spec house. David, that was implied a spec house or house?
Opportunistic developer
Develop.
wanted to build homes which
More than
violate every architectural principle.
Right. Well, the other way you could say is, look, if you're in a butter or a neighbor or a group of neighbors, you could say, look, you should go talk to somebody like myself. It doesn't have to be me, but someone else who understands this, and say, look, this is the marketplace. Let's talk about the market. Let's talk about the cost of construction. Let's talk about what this neighborhood can support in terms of value. Talk the language of the developer and say, look, I can do the pro forma just as quickly as you can. It's going to cost you $600 a square foot. The market, you know, I know the market's looking for, who is the demographic of the market? What are they looking for? I can tell you what they are. They're 42 years old. They work for Bain Capital. They've got 3 kids. The wife drives a Range Rover. They're coming from another house. I know exactly what the guy makes. And I know what he wants. I know what she wants. I know what the kids need. And I can tell you who the demographic is. I can tell you to the dollar what they'll spend on the house. So knowing all that and knowing how zoning works, you know, is it 1 lot? Is it 2 lots? Can you get 3 lots? You know, what can you do with that? There's some wetland potential issues maybe there too. So if you can talk to the language of design, and if it's a spec developer and his interest is to get in and out and spend the least amount and make the most amount of money, then you can say, you're going to need to protect the landscape there because it's all mature landscape. Don't level the site. If you've got topography, which you may have, that's going to run into costs. Design a house that works with the land, not just bulldozer everything and build a box on top of the land. But that's what I'm saying. People, and as architects, you need to know development. You need to know performance. You need to know what things cost. You need to know, you know, if you don't, get a landscape architect that does. Work with them on land planning and dealing with topography. So you kind of need to know this stuff like that. If the neighbor says, look, I'm going to hire you to represent our interests against this project, you need to hire someone that knows the language of development, not just, oh, the house is too big, or gee, it's ugly. So that's the answer for that.
We have another question. Thanks for your informative pep talk for architects in the profession. This has been wonderful. Can you speak more about your you as a developer architect? How did you get started?
So I moved to Boston in 1973. In 1975, I saw an opportunity to buy a building at 165 Commonwealth Avenue. It was rent control in Boston back then, so that the building was 9 apartments. It was $145,000. Older couple lived on the first floor, and they rented the building to young professional women. They didn't want any beer drinking guys in their building. And I sold my car. I had by then had a nice old Mercedes SL that I restored. I sold it for $8,500. I got the owner of the building to give me a second mortgage of $20,000. And then I went to, there was a thing in Boston called redlining, where banks wouldn't lend past, say, Dartmouth Street on Commonwealth Avenue because people were burning down buildings for insurance money and buildings were boarded up and there were rooming houses. It's not the Back Bay of today. So I went to South Boston Savings Bank. It was the only lender that would lend there. And with my name, the first thing the guy says to me is, well, what parish are you from? Now, I'm from Long Island. I'm not from South Boston or Dorchester. And I really didn't know what to say. I said, well, you know, I really haven't been going to church very often. But at the end of the day, he says, look, I want to help my Southie boys. It's John Connolly, and I'll give you the mortgage. So I sold the car, and the second mortgage gave me the down payment. So I bought the building with no money. And then I had to charm my way through to get these women to leave. It was vacancy decontrol. If they left on their own, I could then convert the building to condominiums. I think I was making, at Ben Thompson's, I think I was making $16,000 a year. And And so I had to wait the year to get everybody to move out. And then I did the condo conversion and I made $200,000 in 1977. I went out and bought a used Porsche 911 and I bought 2 other buildings. And I bought a building on Marlborough Street as a burned out shell for it was $29,000. And I went back to my good friends at South Boston Savings Bank, and I did a condo conversion there. And then I bought another building. Then I bought a couple units, and then I did some joint venturing. I did the first new building on Commonwealth Avenue in 100 years at Berkeley Street. And I did a joint venture with a guy. And I got the whole building approved in one hearing for the Back Bay Architectural Commission. I did a New York entryway. I got an extra floor to the building. I did it all in concrete slabs, so the floors were thin, so I could get the extra, stay within the height restriction. And it was a very successful financial project. And then I started, doing joint ventures where I would get a flat fee to do a building. Sometimes I do a whole building for $1,000. I do the condo docs extra. But if I got an extra floor or I got a garage, the value of the unit would go up per square foot considerably. So I would take the shot and I would get the kicker, or I would get the equity. I said, I want 10% of the profit if I get you this and this and this. So that's that, Long Island, New York DNA, I had nothing to lose, came from zero, and the stick-to-itness. And going back to the art of the sale, I was pre-selling buildings. And I was doing these gut rehabs, and I was doing these modern interiors, these curved walls and wood ceilings, and I got a brand. So people wanted my brand. So I was selling to all these young people that were coming to Boston or went to school in Boston or wanted to stay. And I was selling, floor-through condos for $45,000. I was selling penthouses for $70,000 and things like that. And it was worthwhile. And that's kind of how I did it.
That's awesome. That's just awesome.
Thoroughly
Using
inspired.
your
I don't know which
expertise.
direction to head off in after this
Yeah.
pep talk.
Well, you just really work a lot, and I was single and I had nothing to lose too. So
Patrick, thank you so much for giving us your entire afternoon. This has been remarkable. Your work is amazing. Everyone, I'm sure, here knows it. Our next lecture is going to be coming up in about a month and a half with Tom Kligerman.
great.
It's going to be wonderful. He does wonderful traditional work that's done a little bit more modern.
Right. He's also a great storyteller.
He's an amazing, he's great.
He also wanted to be a car designer and an architect, just like I did. So we
And you
talk a
both-
lot about cars.
You both ended up sailors and good
Yes,
architects.
that too.
If anybody that wants information on that, you probably follow, there's a mailing list on architecturaldelight.org, one word. We have a small Instagram, follow us there. And there's also the past lecture that we did about a month ago with Michael Ember that's on our site as well, which is also wonderful. So again, Patrick, this was fantastic. Thank you so much.
My pleasure. Okay, good to see you all. Thank you.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye, everybody.
Thank you. Bye bye.